This is a nice big group.
It is, yeah. Hi, everyone. We're gonna wait until 11:35, just so that if there was any stragglers in the big session, that there's a chance to assign them to some of the rooms here.
It's a good idea. And do you have all your note-taking support organized?
I think I saw Margot in here.
I'm here, and I just started recording the session as well, so we've got that.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Awesome.
That looks good, Jessie. We can see your slides.
Oh, okay, awesome. All right, so I think we'll get started. I'm just going to assume that everybody who needs to be here is here. So welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to see the awesome turnout, and I'm really honored to have been invited here today. I work for the city of Saskatoon, and one of those silver linings of the pandemic is just being able to participate more easily in things across the country. So that's it's a really cool experience to be able to join you guys for the conference here. So my topic is going to be on the nature connections and strengthening nature connections. And specifically, I'd like to talk about the kind of interrelatedness of equity, public health, and green infrastructure, which is one of the main things that I work on through my work at the city. Oops. So first, just center ourselves and give you some background. Saskatoon is on Treaty 6 territory, and as well as being on the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. This is a kind of a land acknowledgement that we often say in Saskatoon, where we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of the land and reaffirm our kinship with all of our relations. And I really resonated earlier with the discussion about interspecies equity, because of course our relations are not just the other people that live in the city, but also all of our fellow species as well. So some background on the land that Saskatoon was built on. It's a very unique and special biocultural region. The city was founded in 1882, but the land itself had been inhabited by plains cultures since time immemorial. And the people were active caretakers of the land. Many of you have probably heard of Wanuskewin Heritage Park, which has gotten some international renown for being potentially a new UNESCO World Heritage Site, or they put an application in anyway. But that place was a meeting grounds for many plains cultures, and the city was eventually named for Misaskatoon, which is the Saskatoon berry that grows abundantly in our river valley. Then as the city developed, the South Saskatchewan River, which is kind of one of our big defining features in the city, was a really important consideration for planners and residents, so much so that riverbank stewardship advocacy eventually led to the creation of what we called the Meewasin Valley Authority in 1979. It's the local river system stewardship organization, which protects public access to the river valley, which is so important, and not all places in the world are blessed with that kind of foreplanning. And they also work on ecological and cultural conservation of the cultural resources within the river valley. And so with all of our complex history and governance systems, we have a strong legacy of green space management here in Saskatoon. But of course, as the city grows and expands, we have a projected population growth of growing to around 300,000 to 500,000 people by mid-century. And with all of the converging sort of crises between the pandemic, the biodiversity crisis, the climate change crisis that we're facing, we're recognizing that we need to not just take our natural wealth in the city for granted. We need to be actively planning for that and managing it. At the same time as all of these crises have occurred, you know, many folks, and I know there's been discussion at this conference about that, is access to nature is really, really important for mental, physical, and emotional well-being. But not everyone in the city has the same access to nature. And that's something that we've, that I'll get into a little bit later, but it's kind of, it brings in that whole equity piece. So for one thing, public health disparities often emerge from inequitable access to nature. And of course, that's only going to become more of a challenge with climate change. So like I said, we've recognized that we need to work actively to protect and manage what we call our green infrastructure. And if you're not familiar with the term, I'll show on the next slide some definitions. And so over the last several years, and kind of culminating in February of this year, the administration for the city developed a green infrastructure strategy, which outlines ways that green infrastructure can be woven into the urban fabric while concurrently addressing inequities in the city's green network. So the strategy was completed and presented to our council earlier this year, and it provides a pathway to reach an interconnected green network that everyone in the city can access. This work has also helped us connect with the International Cities with Nature trend, which I really encourage everyone to check out if they haven't seen it already, where cities around the world are recognizing that as the human population becomes more urbanized, connecting people to nature right where they live is really important for our collective well-being. So in developing the green infrastructure strategy, we were able to tap into this kind of global movement, and cities like Vancouver and Victoria were often kind of some of the inspiration for some of the things that we incorporated into the strategy. So here's our definition, because we have noticed that green infrastructure is a term that's getting thrown around a lot increasingly, but it's different policy and government levels tend to refer to it slightly differently. So the federal government tends to refer to green infrastructure as it relates to renewable energy. And in Saskatoon and in many other cities, we're talking more about the natural infrastructure. So our definition is it's a system of natural, enhanced, and engineered assets that provide municipal and ecosystem services by protecting, restoring, or emulating nature. And that point about ecosystem services is really important because as we're increasingly realizing the value of nature is too important to even put a dollar value to at some points, but we try to recognize that that the ecosystem services that forests and grasslands and wetlands and everything does provide a financial benefit to cities, and we need to incorporate that into our municipal planning. So when green infrastructure is designed holistically, it becomes an interconnected green network that enhances the urban environment and improves quality of life. And I love this air photo of City Park and City Park neighborhood in Saskatoon, because it shows where there's human habitat in this photo, but there's also habitat for many other things. We have the urban forest, which is a significant wildlife corridor, especially for birds and insects. We have a community garden down in the bottom right, and of course we have a little section of the river that you can see in the upper left, which is a significant habitat corridor for much of our urban wildlife. And I'm sorry for the graininess of this slide here, but essentially this just shows the spectrum of green infrastructure that we might encounter in the city, and we've kind of shown it on a spectrum of natural to human-made or engineered assets. So on the left we have our significant natural areas. We have a system of swales and wetlands and grasslands within the city that are really important, and the aforementioned Meewasin Valley Authority is involved in the management of. We also have a fair bit of arable land in the city, which is really interesting, and discussions about how much arable land to retain as the city grows has been a really interesting sort of public conversation. And of course, recognizing that we can't separate people from nature, we have a really rich biocultural history in the city, and our ecological landscapes are often overlain with cultural landscapes. And then in the center, some other examples, we have 50 plus urban agriculture community gardens in the city. We have a thriving urban forest. We have systems of trails and greenways. We have low impact development, sort of on a smaller scale, as well as our gray stormwater assets, and which we're working to incorporate more green infrastructure into. So all of that being said, we do have some amazing green infrastructure existing in the city already, but through the green infrastructure strategy, we found that not everyone in the city has the same access to our green spaces. So metrics from the percentage of park space per capita to the percentage of urban forest canopy cover are unevenly distributed. And of course, historic inequities in the green network are a factor as well. Over a century of colonization has left irrevocable impacts on Indigenous and settler people's relationships with each other and with the land. And working towards addressing those impacts, including where public health disparities intersect with green infrastructure distribution, has been recognized by all of us working on the strategy as absolutely vital to moving forward together. And of course, the pandemic has just highlighted the importance of green spaces as well, and just how vital it is for citizens to be able to access green spaces more easily. So, recognizing time limitations, I'll take you through just a few slides very briefly that shows some of our analysis of the green infrastructure distribution in the city, and just highlight how there's some inequity disparities that kind of emerged from that analysis. So this is a map of green space distribution as a percentage of park space by neighborhood, and generally speaking, the areas with the neighborhoods in green are areas with a high percentage of green space, and then the areas in brown have a lower percentage of green space. And the reasons for the uneven distribution are very complex, and there's a history there that I don't have time to get into necessarily, but the general outcome is that some areas in the city are more underserved by green space than others. So for instance, we analyzed these walkability gaps, which is areas of the city which are further than a 5-minute walk to a formal green space in the city. And a 5-minute walk is, we're using that as kind of a precedent or a baseline because that's what the World Health Organization has identified as being ideal. And so we have a space, fairly large walkability gap in our downtown area, and then kind of throughout the city as well. But of course, walkability gaps are defined as kind of as the crow flies, so to speak. So they don't factor in whether there's accessibility gaps in our trail networks, whether our trails are universally accessible, whether there's large busy roadways that are difficult to cross, those types of things. So this is just one type of analysis that we looked at, but it's definitely more complex than this is presented. And then we also have our distribution of natural assets, so our ecological areas, the swales and grasslands and wetlands that I mentioned are kind of concentrated in this northeast quadrant of the city. And then we have a couple afforestation areas in the southwest. We have one of the largest remaining short fescue grassland areas that the university maintains in the city. And we have many wetlands. Where Saskatoon is part of what they call the prairie pothole region, and so the landscape just has many wetlands that that in some cases were kind of filled in or damaged as the city was built, with kind of subsequent flooding challenges. But you can kind of see here on the west side where much of our lower income population is concentrated. There's not a significant access to our natural areas. We do have the afforestation areas, but these are largely difficult to access because of a highway that kind of crosses right around here, and so they're not super accessible for people in these low-income neighborhoods, and that's been identified as one of those things that we do need to address through the strategy. Oops. We do have a network of community gardens and other types of urban agriculture sites in the city, and this map doesn't show it very clearly, but it relates to that earlier slide about the park space distribution in the city, because many of the existing community gardens are located on formal parks or municipal reserve, and many of the areas where there's limited community garden spaces also correspond with where there isn't a lot of like formal park space that a community garden could go. And so one thing that we're looking at is whether we can improve the distribution of community gardens in the city by looking at informal green spaces like boulevards, medians, even brownfields. There are some brownfield container-based community gardens in the city, and whether we can expand capacity in that is the sort of a thing that we're working on. And then this is the distribution of our urban forest canopy, again with the areas in green with a fairly high percentage of urban forest, and the areas in brown and yellow lower percentage. And so that again is kind of unevenly distributed, which is something that we want to consider when we're factoring in for climate change adaptation, because it's been shown that a higher percentage of urban forest canopy cover at a certain point, I believe it's around 40%, really starts to ameliorate the effects of the urban heat island effect. And then finally, we have the yellow here, which is the land use areas with a high percentage of hard surface. So in other words, areas of the city that experience a high urban heat island effect. And of course, there's equity issues that intersect with that as well, because folks who rely primarily on active transportation or the public transit system are experiencing the heat island effect more intensely as they navigate through the green network. So that is kind of a discussion on some of the green space inequities that we discovered in our analysis of the green infrastructure strategy. The good news is that some of this analysis has allowed us to identify areas where green infrastructure needs to be strengthened. And equity is one of the guiding principles for the strategy. So we can use that kind of as a baseline to prioritize sites that have been historically underserved by green infrastructure. So those are the areas in pink here. That very generally some of our priority areas. Now, one benefit is that prioritizing green infrastructure sites in this way has co-benefits. So the intersection of priority areas that are beyond a 5-minute walk to a park also often have a low distribution of green infrastructure, and also sometimes historically due to wetland loss tend to be flood prone. So adding green infrastructure into these sites could potentially improve public health outcomes while also helping to reduce flooding and increase biodiversity and have sort of a myriad of other co-benefits. So taking that sort of interrelated systems thinking approach is really important so that we can kind of help address some of these complex problems and address multiple different issues at once. And I'll start to wrap up here, but I just, this is a photo of some folks out at Wanuskewin Heritage Park, and I really love this photo because it shows that kind of humans in nature sort of lens, where it's not about nature in the city, it's about humans being in nature. So taking sort of like a reverse to the sort of dominant paradigm, I guess. I'm gonna just check in with my time. There's a really wonderful video of a community member who's planting Saskatoon berry bushes along the river valley, which kind of just sums up really nicely. It's a really good news story about working towards more green infrastructure in the city with a very sort of community-minded approach. I'm not sure if I'll have time to play the whole thing, but I will share the link. And you can check it out on your own. So all of this to say that, that we're working towards the vision for the green infrastructure strategy, which is to create a green network that provides sustainable habitat for people and nature. So, so through green infrastructure, we can do both. We can provide equitable access to nature for the residents of the city, but we can also invite nature into the city to start to get into that, that interspecies equity lens. So by identifying where there's gaps in Saskatoon's existing green infrastructure and working to strengthen that through a public health perspective is one way that Saskatoon will be able to concurrently address converging challenges of biodiversity loss, public health disparities, and climate change. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to come to the session today, and I'm gonna share the link to that the video here, and in the meantime I'm also happy to spend, I would say, probably 10 minutes answering questions.
Thanks so much. That was so interesting, Jessie, and the images that go along with the information really brings to life the space that you're in, and helps me imagine kind of the greenness and the issues of green equity that are surrounding each of us in our own spaces. So not a question, but just wanting to begin with a thank you as Margot brings up her slides. So very thought-provoking.
Oh, thank you very much.
Maybe I will ask a question if I may. I like this idea of green equity as like a conceptual tool, I guess. And I'm wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about how, you know, the history of that term and how it's received. Like, is it a useful tool? Does it resonate with community members? Does it resonate with policymakers? Like, who does that kind of concept work best with? And yeah, just because I don't know that term from the literature, so I want to learn.
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure if it's something that that's being used as kind of an official term in the academic world at this point. It's something that we've been using just in our policy discussions at the city, just to kind of help put sort of a box around this concept that started to emerge when we were working on the strategy and when we were engaging with the public, and just realizing that there is this interrelationship between public health, equity, and access to green space. And so I would say green space equity is kind of just the shorthand for how we've been sort of this idea that we've been working on, and I'm sure that many other municipalities are starting to encounter the same thing as well. I'm not sure that I can specifically speak to the academic lens on it, but I know that a lot of the literature on green infrastructure does focus on access and equity, and why it's so important that everybody has access to green space and other types of green infrastructure. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's yeah.
Yeah, it's a great answer, and I think you're right. It's it does a lot of linking up, and I know even here in Vancouver, in affiliation with CAPE, they're advancing like green prescribing and stuff, and we also have blue and green gyms, and that's in the UK especially, being linked to equity and access, especially for inner city kids and so on. And in Australia, the work is very active there as well. So I agree. I think it's a great term, and it does really make those great links between social phenomena and environmental preservation and access being a key measure of equity. Who has access, and access for what, and how is that access protected, and so on. So yeah, very exciting tool and lever to be able to use.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I should also mention is that we did end up taking some of those map analysis pieces that I showed you and turning those into key performance indicators so that we can actually measure, use the SMART principles to measure our progress and actually make sure that we're improving. So whether it's sort of the percentage of the population that's within a walking distance to a park or green space, or like various other metrics, we're able to incorporate those into sort of tangible equity-based indicators.
May I ask one last question, and I don't want to dominate, but I just am curious about what you've seen between your work and then what's happened with COVID and people's access to outdoor space and green space, because it seems like that's like another layer of evidence about disproportionate lack of access.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we don't have a lot of like hard numbers yet. We're actually talking with Wanda Martin, who's in the conference here, about doing a research project to help us quantify some of those things. But anecdotally, we're hearing lots of things. So the Meewasin Valley Authority, which manages the River Valley Trail System, has been letting us know that their trails often aren't wide enough to accommodate people incorporating the physical distancing guidelines, but at the same time, people really want to use this opportunity to get out into green space, and so there's been a real influx of people checking out our parks, trail system, and natural areas, but then at the same time encountering these physical distancing sort of limitations, and so that's been a real challenge for sure. And then of course there's the distribution of park space, which isn't like some folks in the city have lots of parks to choose from and some don't, and so that kind of just gets further sort of accentuated by the pandemic. But I'm really interested to work with Wanda here in the next little while. We're hoping to apply for a research grant to like actually quantify that and see specifically what those numbers are. Maybe do some public surveys and things like that.
Hi, I have a question. So I live in Saskatoon, and I'm curious about how you see this connecting, or if it does connect with the previous presentation around like the One Planet Living Cities, because I thought that was very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that as climate change and all of these crises that we've been discussing become more prevalent, I think that there is a discussion where we need to have about how we can increase public access to green space and green infrastructure, but also how we can reduce our overall footprint. And I think that, there's some really interesting things that we could look at that might emerge from that. Like the conversation that we're having a lot is around traditional and indigenous food practices and food access in the green network, and can we incorporate more food sovereignty ideas into our green spaces? And of course that also intersects with this One Planet Living approach and reducing our overall footprint. And I think, making cities more sustainable inherently involves reducing our footprint and trying to in-house more of our needs as a population, whether it's increased food security, water security, reduced transportation costs, or whatever the case may be, solar energy, all of that. And I think those discussions will help us prioritize how we distribute land uses across the city. I'm getting a note that there's only 15 minutes remaining, so I guess I should move on to the next part of the conversation. Sorry to cut anyone off if you had a burning question. So I am just going to pull up my my questions. So the main questions that we're to discuss is, what are some key implications for public health and personal action? I think that we've already been kind of talking about this a little bit already, but does anyone have any thoughts around that?
I see Karen's question, and it might be a nice segue into this notion of action.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
In the chat box.
Are there provincial or federal policy approaches that could enhance this work for Saskatoon and other municipalities? Definitely, yes. It's I have to take a moment to think about some specific examples. But one thing that we're talking about in the city is how we designate land, how we prioritize land designations, things like that. So whether we can start incorporating environmental reserve as a land designation into the city, so that we can actually allocate natural areas and the protection of natural areas right from the planning stages when we're planning new neighborhoods. And so that the other sort of criteria being that we'd like to start planning our neighborhoods around our natural spaces rather than the other way around. We need to look at what cultural and ecological spaces are in an area before we go planning a neighborhood on top of that. And so that's been one sort of big policy discussion, and I would love to go down a rabbit hole and talk to you about that for an hour. Don't have time, but yeah, definitely some things, and I can maybe write up some ideas to send around later with some more details.
May I ask another question? If, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking about culture shifts. What are tools? And I think about other countries in the world that are not dealing with only like car-dominated spaces, for example. And so the idea of time and free time and time spent in nature and with people in green space and so on, that's like more embedded into the cultural frame. In North America, we're like into hyper productivity, fast car, transportation corridor, all these things, right? So I'm just wondering if you have any experience about how we could begin to create a cultural shift so that planning around green spaces is more logical to us, and having more walkable cities is logical, all of these kinds of things that maybe bring people into green space in meaningful ways. Because right now we don't really know what a green space is for us, and maybe it's healthy, and then the people who are in green space a lot are like, whatever, super, whatever, obsessed about hiking, or you know what I mean? There's all these narratives. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that in Saskatoon we're kind of on the cusp of a cultural shift in some ways. Like we're seeing it a lot in just how people talk about green spaces. There's a lot of controversy right now around protecting some of our large natural areas, and how do we value that versus road development. And there's a lot of public discourse happening around that right now, and I think that that things have the potential to shift, especially with kind of COVID as a driver for a cultural shift where people start to think about like, well, what are the benefits of working from home, or not needing to commute so much, or wow, I can actually see the sky because the smog is reduced. That's not been such a significant problem in Saskatoon, but I know it is in many other cities in the world. So it's yeah, I think we're kind of on the verge of it, and in some ways the city is able to lead by example by like, for instance, through our Healthy Yards program, we're able to demonstrate that you don't just need to have a Kentucky bluegrass lawn. You can also incorporate like native plants or drought tolerant species into your yard. That we don't have to have this specific ideal of what an aesthetic yard is one example that I can think of off the top of my head. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Okay, so I see one question from Andrea. One of the problems we've been having in accessing green spaces, trails that are walking distance, is that most of them are needles infested and unsafe to go to. Yeah, so there's definitely sort of an intersection of green space access with people's feelings of safety and security, as well as people, whether or not people feel welcome in a green space. And yeah, that's a complicated one. I think that it touches on a lot of well, there's the public health element of how we're currently approaching the addictions crisis versus maybe how we should be approaching the addictions crisis. And yeah, well, it just touches on so many other conversations that that I feel like the world is having right now about just like how we interact with each other. And I'm not sure that I have all of the answers, but it's so important that everybody feels safe and welcome in green spaces, and exactly how we get from the point that we're currently in to how we to where we'd like to go is I think it's context specific, and it maybe requires some like another cultural shift and figuring out what the key drivers are, and not just implementing a band-aid solution. Well, if we just send somebody around to pick up all of the needles, then it'll be fine. Like that, yes, that's a good band-aid solution, but we have to go deeper. So it's interrelated, and I know that doesn't give you a direct answer, but it's a good question. All right, I think we have 5 minutes left. So I think that we should move on to the next point, summarizing sort of the top 3 to 5 points, and choosing somebody to report back to the larger group. So we talked about definitions of green space equity, and how that relates to key performance indicators. We talked about traditional food access. What are the policy implications? People's feeling of safety and security in the green network.
And then I just added in the chat box, just it's what you've said already, but just placing on it the word like class and access and use of green space, which is partly what we're talking about in terms of needles and access, but also when I was working in blue and green gyms in the UK on kind of nature prescribing and so on, there was lots of inner city kids, even in the city I was working in Brighton, who'd never been to the ocean. And yet people come from all over the world to go to the ocean, and they were a 20-minute bus ride away. But leaving their kind of inner city situation, getting on a bus having a desire to go to the ocean, not the mall or whatever. All of those things were very classed things, and it starts with children as well. So just saying those words as part of our report back.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and we have found that in Saskatoon as well, where there's this beautiful river that kind of intersects the city, and there's some folks in the city who don't feel safe crossing the river because they live on the west side and they don't feel safe going to the east side of the city. And of course that connects back to all of the conversations that are happening around policing and Black Lives Matter and all of that right now. And it's a real problem in Saskatoon, just like it is everywhere else, that we need to figure out what the root of this struggle is and address it in a meaningful way. And it definitely interacts with class and marginalization and all of that as well. And Jillian says, this even applies rurally in the north. Lots of our people have no access to biking, camping, fishing, etc. It's right here, but knowledge, safety, and materials to access this are not accessible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So in our last 3 minutes, does somebody want to volunteer to reiterate the main points back in the bigger session? Would you like me to? How would we like to proceed? Oh yeah, same in Vancouver. A lot of trails require access to a car. Bus transportation isn't adequate. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the same sorts of struggle, where there's people who are higher income or have more job security or just are generally more privileged tend to be able to access these spaces more easily. Mm-hmm. And then on the anxiety note, I think that also connects back with whether everybody feels welcome in green spaces, because there's as we've seen in the States recently, there's it's not folks with different backgrounds or in different life situations don't always get treated equally by the people they encounter in their green spaces, and which is a huge tragedy that I think that we need to address. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of answering your question, I'm happy for Jessie, you and Margot to report back if that's, or however. All sounds good. I vote for whatever feels good.
Okay, sounds good.
Jessie, I can pull the key points up, and then if you want to speak to them, that would be great.
Okay, perfect. So any other questions or comments? I see we have less than a minute left. So maybe I'll just say, I'll go through the chat box here and see if there was any questions that I didn't manage to address, and I'll type up my thoughts and send those around afterwards. And yeah, I really encourage everyone to check out that CTV video that I shared. It's a good news story. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the session. I hope that you got something out of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks, Margot, for taking these amazing notes.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Margot.
Not a problem. Thanks so much for the great conversation, and thanks for sharing, Jessie.
I was happy to.